Was the dome that covers the earth destroyed by God? Is it still up there? Or perhaps maybe it's gone? And the reason for thinking it may be destroyed comes from the book of Genesis and Noah's flood. So this is the 1560 Geneva Bible, which is a great translation of the Bible. For one, it's before the King James translation, so it goes back a little older than KJV, but it also has quite a few illustrations, such as this one. Here's another one where we have a map. It says the situation of the Garden of Eden. So a map of the Garden of Eden, but going back to the first book of Moses called Genesis. And we have the creation of the world. And God said, let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the dome, and he separated the waters which were under the dome from the waters which were above it. Now, supposedly it's pretty cold up in, I don't know what they call that, space or something like that. But at a high elevation, it's supposedly cold. And that means that one possibility is that the dome is made out of ice, and that the dome itself is the waters above, but it's also a physical barrier in that it's ice. Now, before the flood, people lived very long lives. Here, Lamech was 777 years old. That is quite an age, but that's the father of Noah. And Noah's grandfather is Methuselah, who is the longest living person ever, recorded 969 years, and then he died. But once the flood happens, the lives of humans are reduced dramatically. God said that my spirit shall not always strive to be with man, because he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. And this is exactly correct. About the oldest humans live is right around 120 years. Now, although there is some debate about the exact number of years that these people lived, it is pretty clear that before the flood, people lived a lot longer. Here's from Adam to Noah, and we can see the average age is pretty much around 900 years old, except Enoch at 365. The exact number of days in a year was taken by God without dying. Now, once the flood happened, the ages didn't instantly change. There was a period of time where their ages slowly declined until it got right down to where we're at today, which is 120 years. But it didn't take that many generations, about 10, to get from the 900 or the 700 year lifespan down to 600, 400, 200, and eventually where it ends here at 120 years. So during the flood, we have water coming from somewhere that completely covers all of the land. So, the earth is down there, and we have water that's completely covered over all the land. Now, if the dome over earth that God created in Genesis 1 was made out of ice, one way is to melt that and have the melting water come down into the earth to cause the flood. And if the melting or the destruction of that dome, which was all made out of ice, then came down into the water down here, we would have all the water raising up, of course, and covering all of the lands for the global flood. With an ice dome covering the earth, especially if the sun is outside of the dome, then you would have a greenhouse effect on the entire earth. The earth wouldn't be exposed to any of the ultraviolet radiation that comes from the sun, and essentially the entire earth would have a greenhouse effect. And the Garden of Eden was supposedly quite the lush, vegetative, all kinds of life was growing there. And that's what you would expect if the entire Garden of Eden was a greenhouse. And if we weren't exposed to any ultraviolet radiation from the sun, and we lived inside of a literal greenhouse, not only would plant life be extremely abundant, you may find that plant life gets huge and that the trees would grow much, much bigger than they do now. Additionally, humans who aren't exposed to any of the UV radiation and live inside of a greenhouse will probably live much, much longer than if they were exposed to the direct rays of the sunlight. So the question is this decline of mankind's age and aging when they die at 120 years, is this caused from something physical that may have happened to our Earth in that the dome was destroyed or melted? And once it was gone, God knew that man's days would be limited to 120 years from that point forward. It also would explain where all this water came from, which flooded the entire earth, that the dome was melting, or ice pieces had broken and fallen down into the ocean. And while this image is not authentic, it does make the point that we have found woolly mammoths essentially frozen in place as if they got hit instantly with some kind of ice. And scientists, of course, probably have their explanation, but why do we have woolly mammoths frozen in the ice instantly? And perhaps if this dome of ice were to be melted or was to be broken and fall into earth, I can't imagine large chunks of ice causing this to happen, because it would just smash the animal. But if it, if the ice dome was pulverized or something of that nature, and ice shards were to have fallen down, you may end up with the frozen animals like we find. So that's it for this theory. And it's just a question if the dome is still out there, or if perhaps God destroyed it during the flood, which led to all the water coming to earth, causing the flood, and also would cause man's years to be reduced from the 900 down to the 120, because they're no longer living inside of a greenhouse. And that may also be an explanation for why we find some of these extinct species frozen solid in ice. But thank you for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.